Hi there. Welcome to another video lesson intended to provide you important principles and helpful tips for the study and practice of argumentation. This video is the first of a two-part series looking at one of the fundamental building blocks of any argument: evidence. Because after all, if you don't have evidence to support the claim that you're not making an argument. So not only to be better arguers ourselves, but also to be more critical consumers of the arguments we encounter every day, we want to have a better understanding of this fundamental building block. So in this video, we'll consider the characteristics of what actually makes evidence, as well as the single most important requirement that any piece of evidence needs in order to ultimately be effective logically and rhetorically. We'll spend a little bit of time defining the different types of evidence that can be used in constructing arguments, and I want to illustrate how these different types of evidence can be used in isolation as well as in combination, using one of the most important and perhaps devastating public policy cases in recent US and world history. And finally, and especially given the examples that we're going to see, I want to end the lesson with some guidelines for presenting evidence in a way that not only is going to be optimally effective, but also is going to be optimally ethical. Because as in any other element of argument, we don't just want to be effective, we also want to do the right thing. And balancing those two elements is especially crucial when we're talking about evidence. So since we're talking about evidence, what is evidence? Reminding ourselves about what Dr. Joseph Wenzel referred to as the logical perspective of argument is a pretty good place to start. As paraphrased by Inch and Tudor, the logical perspective of argument emphasizes the accuracy of the premises and the correctness of the inferences linking premises and evidence to the claims they support. So if you recall an earlier video in this series, you'll remember that when we're talking about premises, essentially what we're talking about are points of agreement between the arguer and the audience that are used as the basis of building toward a conclusion in order to convince the audience of the correctness of that conclusion. And evidence is a primary form of premise that's used in any argument. And so when we're thinking about evidence from a logical perspective, we want to be primarily concerned with accuracy. Is the evidence true? And is the evidence then going to be a sound foundation for the claim that we want the audience to accept? So what is evidence? Inch and Tudor lay out that evidence can be one of three related things. Evidence can be facts or conditions that are objectively observable. Evidence can be beliefs or statements generally accepted as true by the recipients. That's what we mean by premises. Or evidence can be conclusions previously established. In an earlier video in this series, we talked about the idea of argument chains and the notion that once a particular claim has been proven with evidence and reasoning, and then the audience accepts it to be true, that claim itself is now a point that can be used as the evidence building a foundation to a subsequent claim. That's how we build complex cases. So whether we're talking about objective facts, whether we're talking about premises, whether we're talking about previously established conclusions, there's one important characteristic that all of these approaches to evidence have in common. Evidence is accepted by the audience and can be used to support statements, claims that are not accepted. And it's this piece, accepted by the audience, that is absolutely crucial. If we remember the co-orientational model of argument, we'll remember that the context of disagreement essentially divides the context into two realms. A realm in which the arguer and the audience are disagreeing on points, and a realm in which the arguer and the audience are agreeing on points. We call this line the level of dispute. So, an argument's claim is always going to be positioned in the realm of disagreement, because if the audience agreed with our claim already, we wouldn't have to argue, right? So a claim needs to be supported by evidence and then needs to include reasoning that provides a rational link between the evidence and the claim. The co-orientational model reminds us that if the audience finds the evidence to be true and the reasoning to make sense, then the claim must be true. And if these conditions apply, then the level of dispute will rise and the claim then will exist in the realm of agreement. Now, what does this mean about evidence? Well, it means that at a certain point, in order to have an effective argument that the audience is going to accept as true, the evidence needs to fall below the level of dispute within the realm of agreement. And if that evidence doesn't fall within the realm of agreement, then that evidence itself needs to be proven as true by additional evidence and reasoning. Because if they don't agree at base with our evidence, then we're never going to convince them of our claim. Okay, so given the crucial relationship between evidence and the audience, what is it that we're going to use as evidence? Well, Inch and Tudor basically boil it down to two primary characteristic types: facts and opinions as to fact. Now, often when we think about evidence, when we first get started in studying argumentation, we really gravitate toward facts. But it's going to be important to note, and this should be a big takeaway from the lesson, that in some cases, opinions can be absolutely legitimate and credible and logical forms of evidence. And in certain kinds of arguments, especially when we're arguing claims of value or policy, opinions might be the best kind of evidence to use, not just from a rhetorical perspective, but from a logical perspective. Okay, so let's describe each of these characteristic types. A fact, according to Inch and Tudor, is a thing that people believe to be the case either because they've experienced them firsthand or because they regard them as the truthfully reported experiences of others. So we can see why facts are so compelling, because it is objectively observed and recorded reality. And there's lots of ways that we can use facts. For instance, we can use reports and descriptions, what Inch and Tudor refer to as non-numerical or narrative accounts of some object or occurrence. We use reports and descriptions, for instance, whenever we back up a claim with an example or an illustration, some kind of test case that we use as the basis, for instance, of making a more generalized claim. We also use reports and descriptions when we use lay testimony. Testimony is essentially the report coming from some witness to reality. And when we say lay testimony, we're talking about the testimony of non-experts. Beyond non-numerical reports, statistics can be a very compelling form of factual evidence. Statistics are quantitative facts and figures that have been systematically collected and ordered so as to convey information. Statistics are a compelling form of factual proof because we're talking about reality that not only has been observed, but it's been measured, it's been quantified. We know how much, how many, how big, how long. It's something that is the epitome of empirical reality. So we deal with statistics, for instance, when we use complete measurements of whatever phenomenon we're talking about. But we don't just use complete measurements. Sometimes we can't. In scientific study, in the measurement of public opinion, and in a variety of other contexts, what we do is we use statistical calculations based on samples. If we want to find out, for instance, how many American citizens approve or disapprove of the president's work in office, we can't ask every American citizen if they approve or disapprove. It just can't be done. But what we can do, and what social scientists have been able to do, is to devise ways to come up with representative samples, a smaller group to observe and to get the data from, in this case, approving or disapproving of the president, and use statistical calculations in order to extrapolate, here's how many Americans in total approve or disapprove of the president. Social scientific use of statistics can be a really useful and logically accurate way to get a sense of reality. However, statistics can also be abused in many ways. That's going to be the subject for another video. But just bear in mind for now that, in the classic words of former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, there can be lies, damn lies, and statistics. The third form of factual evidence that gets used a lot in argument is artifacts, physical object evidence that helps to prove an argument. Sometimes the most compelling, objectively real proof is physical objects. So when you think about scene of the crime stuff, in the trials you've seen on TV where people are making reference to, well, here's the broken window that shows that there was forced entry, or here's the blood with the DNA, not just of the victim, but also of the defendant to show that the defendant committed the crime. Here's the fingerprints all over the murder weapon. Artifacts in the form of physical objects can carry with it important information that can be used to support claims. It's important to remember, though, that it's not just the information carried by artifacts that can count as evidence. Many times we can also use artifacts in the form of props or models in order to provide example illustration of an important idea to help the audience really get a clear understanding of some form of factual reality. Okay, so we have reports and descriptions, we have statistics, and we have artifacts. When we move from factual evidence to opinion as to fact, there aren't as many different types because it pretty much is all the same thing. What it means is that the reality that's being used to support the claim depends on expert and credible interpretation of facts. Sometimes it's not enough just to have the physical object evidence, or just to have the raw statistical data, or the reports from eyewitnesses compiled and recorded. What we need to do sometimes is dig into, well, what do those reports mean? What do those numbers really indicate? How do we interpret the information that's being provided by the object? And that's where expert testimony comes in. We have folks that have specific knowledge, specialized experience in a particular area relevant to the facts that are being talked about. And so expert testimony can apply to any of the factual evidence types. Perhaps the easiest form of expert testimony to explain, because it's something we're all familiar with if we watch any kind of TV or movies, right, is the kind of expert testimony that happens in a trial when you bring in a scientific expert in order to explain what the physical evidence says, bringing in experts on genetics and pulling genetic information from blood evidence, bringing in psychological or psychiatric expertise in order to determine whether or not a defendant knew or didn't know what they were doing is wrong. We can't just always rely on the raw data. Sometimes we need to rely on the opinions of people who look at that raw data and help us understand what it means or what we really ought to do with it. Expert testimony can also come in handy when we're arguing claims of value and claims of policy, when we're moving from factual information to making a subjective determination of how valuable or worthwhile something is, or whether or not we should or should not engage in some action based on that factual information. So, again, facts, very important as evidence, but don't forget that opinions, especially opinions in the form of credible expert testimony, can be vitally important for effective arguments. So, we've got a number of different types of information at our disposal that we can use as evidence to back up our claims. A variety of different approaches to using factual evidence, as well as using opinion as to fact in the form of expert testimony. Now, you'll notice at this point, I didn't get into a lot of detail with bunches of specific examples of all of these different types of evidence, because what I want to do is give you an example of a particularly impactful argument made on the world stage using a wide variety of factual and expert testimony opinion evidence in order to make the case for an incredibly consequential public policy decision, one that actually, in retrospect, turned out to be a really bad idea. But in order to do that, I need to make one additional point first, and that is that these different types of evidence are often not going to be used in isolation. What we're often going to find in complex arguments is that these different types of factual and opinion evidence can be used in combination to really lay down a solid foundation, logically as well as rhetorically, for supporting our claims. Now, the example that I want to share with you comes from February 5th, 2003. Secretary of State Colin Powell is presenting the case for authorizing military force against the nation of Iraq based on their possession and potential use of weapons of mass destruction. Prior to this speech, the United Nations had imposed sanctions on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, demanding that they dismantle their weapons program and that they open up their sites to international weapons inspectors to establish that once and for all they did not have weapons of mass destruction. In making the case for engaging in military force against Iraq in 2003, Colin Powell takes evidence gathered by the Bush administration and their allies to make the case for military force, basically establishing the following factual claim. Iraq has weapons of mass destruction in violation of United Nations sanctions. They are not revealing the sources of these weapons of mass destruction. They refuse to dismantle them, and there is a clear and present risk that they will use these weapons against their adversaries. Now, here's some excerpts from the speech made by Secretary Powell at the United Nations. And what I want you to notice first is how different types of evidence are used in combination in order to support his factual claims.
We also have satellite photos that indicate that banned materials have recently been moved from a number of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction facilities. Let me say a word about satellite images before I show a couple. The photos that I am about to show you are sometimes hard for the average person to interpret, hard for me. The painstaking work of photo analysis takes experts with years and years of experience, poring for hours and hours over light tables. But as I show you these images, I will try to capture and explain what they mean, what they indicate to our imagery specialists. Let's look at one. This one is about a weapons munition facility, a facility that holds ammunition at a place called Taji. This is one of about 65 such facilities in Iraq. We know that this one has housed chemical munitions. In fact, this is where the Iraqis recently came up with the additional 4 chemical weapon shells. Here you see 15 munitions bunkers in yellow and red outlines. The 4 that are in red squares represent active chemical munitions bunkers. How do I know that? How can I say that? Let me give you a closer look. Look at the image on the left. On the left is a close-up of one of the 4 chemical bunkers. The 2 arrows indicate the presence of sure signs that the bunkers are storing chemical munitions. The arrow at the top that says security points to a facility that is a signature item for this kind of bunker. Inside that facility are special guards and special equipment to monitor any leakage that might come out of the bunker. The truck you also see is a signature item. It's a decontamination vehicle. When Iraq finally admitted having these weapons in 1995, the quantities were vast. Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of a teaspoon. Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001. This forced several hundred people to undergo emergency medical treatment and killed 2 postal workers just from an amount just about this quantity that was inside of an envelope. Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters. If concentrated into this dry form, this amount would be enough to fill tens upon tens of thousands of teaspoons. And Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material.
Okay, so I think it's pretty clear to see from this example that Powell's account of Iraq's possession, deception regarding, and potential use of weapons of mass destruction makes a pretty compelling case. There are lots of examples of specific facts, as well as lay and expert testimony from people who are in a position to know and people who are in a position to draw conclusions about the evidence that all make the case that Iraq had WMD and they weren't being forthcoming with the United Nations about it. However, as you might be thinking, and you may have had in the back of your mind ever since I brought this example up, but Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction in 2003. And that's correct. What we find out after the decision was made by the United States Congress to give President Bush authorization to use military force against Iraq, we discovered, retrospectively, that in fact Iraq did not have these weapons of mass destruction, that there were a whole host of problems with the evidence that was being provided by the administration. Problems not just with outdated or misinterpreted artifact evidence and eyewitness testimony, but also some very real credibility problems with the eyewitnesses that were being used to gather intelligence about WMD. And as we dug into the information, we also discovered that Secretary Powell himself had some very important concerns about reporting these facts to the United Nations, given that the administration themselves were aware of these problems. They were aware of the credibility problems with many of their witnesses. They were aware of some of the problems with the intelligence that they gathered that was not actually accurate or may have come from faulty sources. And so this illustrates not only that combining powerful forms of evidence can make a compelling rhetorical case, it also lays out an important distinction between evidence that is seemingly logically effective and therefore rhetorically persuasive, and at the same time evidence that is ethically problematic because it's just not true. And a case can be made that the arguer himself knows that it's not true. So this is why we want to end this lesson talking briefly about some guidelines for presenting evidence yourself. If you're engaged in the construction of arguments, how do you make sure that you strike that best balance between using evidence in a way that is logically and rhetorically effective with evidence that is being used in a way that is ethically responsible? The first thing you want to make sure that you do is to avoid unethical omissions. One of the darkest marks on Secretary Powell's career from that point on was the fact that while he was making these arguments to the United Nations, he was aware of the problems involved in gathering that information, the problems with the facts, the problems with the eyewitness testimony, and he did not disclose that information to the United Nations. Keeping something back that you know hurts your case may make your case more persuasive, but it's also wrong and can lead folks to make faulty conclusions. In the case of military force against Iraq, that faulty conclusion led to the deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians. So you want to avoid those unethical omissions. We also want to indicate distinctions between primary and secondary sources. One of the things that was really problematic about making the case for war based on WMDs in Iraq was that the overwhelming amount of evidence came from secondary sources. Not information that the United States had confirmed itself, but information that we had got from sources that were essentially saying, hey, trust me, I know. And that's why in criminal courts and civil courts, hearsay evidence is deemed inadmissible because it's potentially problematic. Now, the distinction between primary sources, sources that have direct access to observe and record the information, as opposed to secondary sources who are providing information based on the reports of primary sources, that distinction can be important. This is not to say that secondary sources are never good sources of evidence. They can be really good sources of evidence. But if you've got better primary sources, that may be the thing that establishes a stronger case as well as a more credible case. Along the way, we want to make sure that we're citing our sources, including the qualifications of those sources. And here's where we actually get a positive lesson out of Powell's speech before the United Nations. One of the ways that we were able to determine after the fact that the case for WMDs in Iraq was problematic was because that Secretary Powell did cite his sources. He let us know who these witnesses were, and so because we knew who those witnesses were and where they came from, we were able to dig a bit deeper and discover that, there's some problems with these eyewitnesses, that they may have been deceptive or they may have not had the complete information. Now, if Powell would not have cited his sources, we might not necessarily know where that information came from, and we never would have been able to discover that it was actually deceptive. So if you don't tell your audience where you got your information, they're never going to have that opportunity to check on the veracity of your facts and opinions. And so that's an important thing to include. And finally, and related to that point, it's crucial to avoid plagiarism, defined by Inch and Tudor as the use of another person's ideas or words without proper attribution. Plagiarism is theft. It's the theft of the intellectual property of somebody else. Somebody else's words, somebody else's ideas or information. When you take those and you present them without citing your sources and not letting us know they come from somebody else, passing them off as your own, that is intellectual property theft. It's also perpetrating a fraud on your audience because you are passing something off as your own when in fact it's not. And this isn't just one of those rules that you have to abide by because in academic settings you'll get in trouble if you do it. People in careers as varied as the news media and national politics have had careers ruined because the communication they made to the public was discovered after the fact to be stolen from another source without attribution. So, not just because it's the wrong thing to do, but also in terms of the long-term effectiveness of your arguments and of your career as an advocate, you need to cite your sources and you need to avoid plagiarism because, besides the fact it's wrong, getting caught in plagiarism can ruin your credibility and can really seriously set you up for difficult times ahead in your rhetorical career. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's our first lesson on using evidence in logical argument. The two big takeaways I want you to pull from this lesson are, first, to remember that evidence can be facts. It's often facts, but evidence doesn't have to be facts. Evidence can also be credible opinions, premises that are shared between the arguer and the audience, or points that were previously proven in an argument. The other big takeaway that I want you to pull from this lesson is that the primary requirement of any effective evidence is that it must be perceived as true by the audience. So this means not only do you want to make sure that you have high quality evidence that's easy to agree with in order to be logically sound and to be effective for your audience, but this also opens up the ethical obligations that you have as an arguer. Just making your evidence seem like it's true to the audience can help you in the short term get your argument's claim accepted, but it can have some pretty severe ethical consequences. And that's not just a theoretical point, but that's a real-world point with real-world consequences. As always, if you have any questions about this lesson or the points included within it, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll help you out in any way I can. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.